The flight attendant's voice grew louder, making sure everyone could hear. I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane now, or I'll call security. Her words were sharp, her tone dripping with disrespect. Big Shaq, calm as always, looked up at her. With all due respect, ma'am, I've already told you I'm not moving, he said calmly. His voice was steady, almost soothing, but it carried undeniable strength. He had been embarrassed in front of everyone, but no one could have predicted what would happen next, when the man they thought was powerless stood up, took revenge, and revealed who he really was. As we dive into the story, if you believe everyone deserves respect no matter their color or background, click the subscribe button now and let us know where you're watching from. The plane gleamed in the afternoon sun, its sleek design promising a luxurious journey. Inside, the cabin was pure luxury, plush leather seats, gold accents, and an exclusive atmosphere that made every passenger feel like royalty. Passengers moved with ease, their expensive luggage rolling behind them as they made their way toward the sleek private jet on the tarmac. Soon everyone found their spots. Some passengers scrolled through their devices, while others drank water offered by the attentive flight crew. Soft background music played in the cabin. Among the passengers was Big Shaq, a calm and composed man in his early 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer with matching slacks. Big Shaq had a quiet elegance. He moved confidently without trying to stand out. As he stepped into the cabin, his calm presence drew attention. His movements were measured, and his eyes briefly scanned the cabin before heading to his seat. This trip wasn't just another journey. It was to oversee his growing empire. But for now, no one on board knew who he was, and he preferred it that way. Elizabeth, the lead flight attendant, stood at the entrance in her crisp, perfectly tailored uniform. Her sharp features gave her an air of control. She greeted the passengers one by one, her smile warm for some and cold for others, especially people of color. She prided herself on keeping order on the plane, though her version of order often depended on how someone looked or behaved. Elizabeth's welcoming tone changed subtly as she greeted Big Shaq. "Welcome on board," she said curtly, the warmth gone from her voice. Behind Big Shaq were Mr. and Mrs. Williamson, a couple in their late 50s who carried themselves like seasoned travelers. Mrs. Williamson was about to open her Bible, while Mr. Williamson, holding his golf journal, wore an expression of mild curiosity as he observed the scene. Elizabeth's smile brightened when she saw them. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Williamson. Lovely to have you with us again." Big Shaq glanced over his shoulder, noticing the clear difference in her tone. His face stayed calm, though his eyes reflected his awareness of the unspoken dynamic at play. As the other passengers settled in, Elizabeth moved through the cabin, making sure everything was in order. She checked on the Williamson couple with a bright smile. "Is there anything I can get for you before we take off?" she asked. Mrs. Williamson shook her head politely, already absorbed in her Bible. Mr. Williamson nodded toward his bottle of water, showing he was fine. When Elizabeth walked past Big Shaq, her attitude changed again. She glanced at his bag, neatly placed under his seat, and pressed her lips into a thin line. She didn't offer the same courtesy as she did to the others. Instead, she simply walked by without saying a word. She checked on the Williamson couple, offering them a bright smile. "Is there anything I can get for you before we take off?" Mrs. Williamson shook her head politely, already absorbed in reading her Bible. Mr. Williamson nodded toward his bottle of water, signaling he was satisfied. When Elizabeth passed by Big Shaq, her demeanor changed again. She glanced at his bag, neatly placed under the seat, and pressed her lips into a thin line. She didn't offer him the same courtesy. She just walked by without a word. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's attitude shifted because of how you looked or the color of your skin? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to click the subscribe button. Elizabeth Bartlett, in her late 30s, carried herself like someone who thrived on control. Her spotless uniform and perfectly styled hair matched her sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. To Elizabeth, appearances and skin color mattered more than anything else, and her judgments were swift and unapologetic. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Big Shaq settle into his seat. Something about him unsettled her. Not his clothes, his skin color, his calm self-assurance, or the fact that he didn't seek attention like many of the other passengers. Elizabeth saw herself as someone worthy of respect. In her mind, Big Shaq didn't belong. She walked toward him with quick, purposeful strides, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said. Her tone was polite, but it dripped with condescension. "I think you're in the wrong section." Big Shaq looked up at her, his expression calm and respectful. "I believe this is my seat," he replied steadily. Elizabeth's smile stayed fixed, but her tone grew sharper. "I don't think so. This section is reserved for our elite passengers." Nearby, the other passengers began to notice the exchange. A nosy socialite leaned slightly forward, eager to get a better view. Her curiosity piqued. Across the aisle, a friendly businesswoman glanced over, frowning slightly at Elizabeth's tone. But Big Shaq stayed composed. His steady gaze met Elizabeth's as he replied, "You might want to double-check the passenger list before making assumptions." Elizabeth's eyebrows lifted, her irritation barely concealed. "I don't need to check anything," she said sharply. "I know who belongs in our elite section and who doesn't." The tension in the cabin thickened. A few passengers exchanged glances, whispering quietly. Others, clearly uncomfortable, pretended not to notice. One passenger muttered, "Why doesn't he just move to the seat he can afford if he's in the wrong spot?" Another shrugged. "He's probably trying to sneak in for a free upgrade." What a shame. Elizabeth crossed her arms, standing her ground. "If you don't go to the back of the plane where the likes of you belong," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I will have to call security to remove you." Big Shaq tilted his head slightly, his calm and respectful expression unchanged. "Please call whoever you need to," he said firmly, "but I'm not moving an inch." The businesswoman gasped softly and Mrs. Williamson leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. Elizabeth, now visibly angry and frustrated, turned to Aaron, the junior flight attendant, who stood nearby watching nervously. "Aaron," Elizabeth snapped, "escort him to the back of the plane where the likes of him belong, now." Aaron hesitated, glancing nervously between Big Shaq and Elizabeth. She wanted to speak up, to suggest checking the passenger list as Big Shaq had earlier recommended, but Elizabeth's sharp, commanding glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, Aaron nodded and stepped forward, following the command. Big Shaq shifted slightly in his seat, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You might want to think carefully about what you're about to do," he said softly, his voice carrying respect but also an unmistakable warning. Elizabeth scoffed, waving off the warning. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said with pride. "Now get up." What would you do if someone treated you like this on a flight? Would you respond like Big Shaq or act differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit the like and subscribe button for more. Elizabeth's tone grew sharper as she gestured toward the back of the plane. "You're not supposed to be here," she said again, her voice tinged with impatience. The passengers watched in stunned silence, the tension in the cabin like static in the air. Big Shaq leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on Elizabeth. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people when you don't have all the facts," he said quietly. Elizabeth's smirk widened. "And you shouldn't sit in a seat you didn't pay for." Big Shaq calmly picked up his phone, his expression still respectful. He typed something quickly and then placed it back down on the armrest. "You are making a mistake," he said calmly. His words hung in the air. Elizabeth didn't listen. "We'll see about that," she muttered, gesturing again with pride. Aaron, though hesitant, acted as instructed. She stepped closer, her reluctance evident as the scene continued to unfold. Elizabeth's irritation only grew as Big Shaq remained seated, his quiet confidence a stark contrast to her increasingly flustered demeanor. As the tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing moment, Elizabeth folded her arms and turned to the other passengers, as if rallying support. "We have rules for a reason," she declared, Some people just don't respect them. Big Shaq didn't respond to her insults or the murmurs growing around him. Instead, he kept his calm gaze fixed on Elizabeth. His composure, a quiet, unwavering defiance, spoke louder than any words ever could. Erin hesitated, glancing nervously at the passenger list clipped near the cockpit door. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the names, hoping to find proof that Big Shaq belonged in his seat. But before she could speak, Elizabeth snapped, "Erin, what are you doing?" Erin turned, her voice barely audible. "I was just checking." "I've got this under control," Elizabeth interrupted, her tone sharp and commanding. "Don't get involved." Erin stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. She bit her lip, torn between doing what was right and the fear of losing her job. As the tension in the cabin built, a businesswoman dressed in a crisp suit and exuding calm authority smiled at Elizabeth. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth turned to her, her expression briefly softening. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but clipped. Before the businesswoman could say more, Elizabeth interjected, her tone accusatory. "Ma'am, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance." She turned back to Big Shaq, pointing a finger at him. "You're causing a scene," she snapped. Big Shaq met her gaze unflinching. "You're the one making the scene," he said calmly. Elizabeth's face flushed with anger. "I've had enough of this," she snapped. "Either you move or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Big Shaq met her glare with calm resolve. "You can try," he said softly. Elizabeth's frustration boiled over, her voice rising. "Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Big Shaq remained silent, his calm demeanor only fueling Elizabeth's anger. Finally, she stormed off to carry out her other duties, leaving Big Shaq in peace. Big Shaq sat quietly, flipping through the flight journal in his hands as passengers chatted softly. The atmosphere calmed until Elizabeth's subtle hostility began to resurface. Big Shaq had been waiting patiently for a drink, watching as Elizabeth served Mr. and Mrs. Williamson first, then moved to other passengers in the back. Despite her rounds, Elizabeth made no effort to acknowledge Big Shaq or offer him any service. What would you do if you noticed this kind of behavior? Would you step in or stay quiet? Let us know in the comments below. Minutes passed and Big Shaq shifted in his seat, stretching one leg slightly into the aisle to find a more comfortable position. His movement was unassuming, but Elizabeth returned at that moment, her sharp eyes catching the small adjustment. Instead of politely asking Big Shaq to move his leg, Elizabeth deliberately changed her path. Her foot struck Big Shaq's leg, and she gasped dramatically, her voice sharp and loud. "Watch where you're putting your dirty legs." Passengers turned their heads, startled by the commotion. Big Shaq looked up, his expression calm and composed. He simply said, "Thank you." The subtle power of his words hung in the air, leaving Elizabeth to fume as the other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric with tension. Elizabeth's flushed face, the captain's stern presence, and Big Shaq's calm demeanor painted a dramatic contrast. Elizabeth, her defiance still simmering, crossed her arms and muttered under her breath, unwilling to admit her misstep. Big Shaq, however, remained seated, his composed expression unyielding. When the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing an unscheduled landing, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The businesswoman seated nearby leaned closer to Big Shaq and whispered, "What's going on?" "Why are we landing?" Big Shaq glanced at her, his expression still calm, and said nothing. The weight of the silence only heightened the suspense. Elizabeth, unable to process what was happening, turned to the captain. "This is unnecessary," she stammered. "Why are we landing? I've done nothing wrong." The captain's piercing gaze silenced her protests. "Miss Elizabeth," he said with quiet authority, "your actions today have caused disruption and embarrassment, not just to the passenger, but to this airline." This unscheduled landing is on management's orders to address the matter immediately. Passengers exchanged glances, some visibly shocked, others quietly thrilled by the unfolding drama. Erin stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly as relief and disbelief washed over her. Elizabeth's composure began to falter. She looked around the cabin for support but found none. The businesswoman, now openly disapproving, shook her head, while other passengers whispered among themselves, their gazes sharp with judgment. As the plane began its descent, Elizabeth turned back to Big Shaq. Her voice, though softer, still carried a hint of defiance. "Why didn't you just say who you were?" she asked, her tone laced with frustration and a touch of desperation. Big Shaq finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Respect should not depend on who someone is. It should be given to everyone." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Elizabeth's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and she sank into a nearby seat, silent. As the plane touched down, the tension in the cabin began to lift. Passengers prepared for the unexpected landing, some stealing glances at Big Shaq with newfound respect. When the plane came to a stop, airport security boarded swiftly, their expressions professional but stern. The captain gestured toward Elizabeth, and without a word she was escorted off the plane. Big Shaq stood, his towering presence commanding attention, and adjusted his jacket. As he turned to leave the cabin, the businesswoman leaned toward him one last time. "You handled that with grace," she said softly, offering him a small smile. Big Shaq nodded politely and made his way toward the exit, leaving behind a cabin filled with passengers who had witnessed an unforgettable lesson in dignity, patience, and respect. What would you have done if you were in Big Shaq's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more compelling stories like this. The cabin was silent, the weight of Big Shaq's words lingering in the air like an unspoken judgment. Elizabeth clung to his feet, her sobs breaking the quiet. Her earlier confidence was nowhere to be seen, replaced by desperation. The passengers watched, some with pity, others with quiet disdain as the drama unfolded before them. Big Shaq gently stepped back, his calm demeanor unwavering. He bent slightly, extending a hand to Elizabeth to help her stand. His voice, firm yet compassionate, broke the tension. "Stand up, Elizabeth," he said. "Begging won't change what happened, but what you choose to do from this moment on can." Elizabeth hesitated but accepted his hand, rising to her feet, her face streaked with tears and shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Big Shaq nodded. "I hear your apology, but change isn't about words, it's about action. Learn from this experience. Treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of who they are." The passengers erupted into applause, their support for Big Shaq's grace and wisdom filling the cabin. The businesswoman leaned back in her seat, a satisfied smile on her face, while Erin wiped away a tear of relief. One of Big Shaq's assistants stepped forward, handing him a sleek tablet. "Mr. O'Neill," the assistant said, "we've prepared everything for your review. The next steps are ready whenever you are." Big Shaq turned to the pilot. "Proceed with our plans. Ensure Elizabeth receives the appropriate training to reflect on her behavior. This is not just about her, it's about setting a standard." The pilot nodded. "Understood, sir." Big Shaq turned back to the passengers. "Thank you all for your patience. This situation has been a lesson for everyone, including myself. Let's treat one another better, whether on a plane or in life." As he made his way down the aisle, the passengers clapped again, some even cheering. Big Shaq paused at the exit, turning back to Elizabeth. "This isn't just a second chance, Elizabeth. It's your last. Don't waste it." With that, he exited the plane, the assistants following close behind. The sleek SUV waited, its engine humming softly. As Big Shaq stepped inside, the atmosphere inside the plane began to shift, no longer tense, but reflective. Elizabeth stood silently, her face pale as the passengers began murmuring among themselves. Erin approached her hesitantly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Elizabeth nodded, though she still looked shaken. "I'll be better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about you? If you were in Big Shaq's shoes, would you have given Elizabeth another chance? Or would you have handled it differently?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.